Magdalene, if she was here, why did she choose to live in this region? Well, there are many theories about this. When did she end up here? Who was the first to say she came to southern France? I've been researching this. How far back do we have references? Well, in 1056 AD, we have a letter from Rostaing, the Archbishop of Aix, saying, yes, Mary Magdalene was here in the south of France. We have another record from 800 AD of some pilgrims who'd been to Palestine. They mentioned where all the saints were buried, all the tombs, but there was no tomb to Mary Magdalene. That's called the Topography of Gurbach. In 967, we have St. Martha, who's supposed to have come with Mary, being mentioned in Tarascon. And we know that St. Louis, the king of France, visited Saint Baume, this great cave, on his way back from the crusade in 1254. Later, the body of Mary Magdalene was discovered in 1279. We know that an Italian Franciscan visited the cave at Saint Baume in 1248. Now, I thought when I looked into this that, okay, so this was a later legend developed in the time of the Crusades to kind of prove that France had the body of this great saint, and it was a sort of propaganda thing. But no, if you research it, and I've got some books of scholars who've gone into this with huge detail, there are earlier references to her in Provence as early as 700 AD, actually in the written texts. And I think that, somebody should do a thesis on going into all the references to Mary Magdalene's presence in France from the very earliest times. They will find these references at least 700 AD. It was a time of conflict, and it was a time after the birth of Islam when Saracen pirates used to land on the coast here in southern France. And that's why the relics were then taken to Vézelay, which is where we went to on the pilgrimage of our first Mary Magdalene conference, not far from where I live. And they were taken there because they were afraid the Saracen pirates would steal them. Others say no, they weren't all taken, and some remained, but in a different tomb. So, there's some research to be done there. It's very interesting. To me, it's not so much whether the body of Mary Magdalene is here, it's the spirit of the teachings that matter. And that is what I do think does live here, still. But it would be, interesting to do some DNA tests on the bones that are kept in the coffre in the cave in Saint Baume. Okay, I want to move on. Another thing I want to mention here is mountains in the collective imagination of mankind. Why they're so important. The Pyrenees, don't forget, are a mountain range. We now learned yesterday that they're made from the stones thrown by Heracles in honour of his lost love, Pyrenees. And that is from a Jungian perspective a mournful tale about love and loss. It's a Shakespearean tragedy. If I was Shakespeare, I'd rewrite a drama about that story and Heracles coming for his lost love. I don't know if Racine did it or if any French tragedians have done the story of Pyrenees and Hercules. It would be great as an opera, like Tristan and Iseult. But we know that mountains have always evoked this kind of longing in the soul. They're like a symbol of our highest aspirations. The Himalayas are the home of the gods, Shiva and Shakti. And Mount Kailash up on the Himalayas is literally the home of the gods. The Alps were very, very sacred in Celtic Europe. As I've said, they were the home of Jupiter Optimus. The Pyrenees were incredibly important. Diodorus of Sicily from the 1st century BC claimed that the mountains here, all the Pyrenees, were once hidden by forests. Then one day the shepherds set all the forests on fire and they morphed and became melted gold and silver streams. It's a kind of local legend because there is gold and silver in the Pyrenees Mountains. The Pyrenees' highest mountain summits are often referred to as sleeping giants. For instance, the Aneto summit in the Spanish side of the Pyrenees. They say that the locals there say you can hear the mountains' laments, the sleeping giants' laments during storms. And there's another great summit, the Puigmal summit that was described as a human being whose mission was to protect nature. Abellio, known as Abellion, was the most important deity of the Pyrenees, and he was associated with these mountains. He was a solar god, often associated with Apollo, and the Gallic god Belinus, or Lu, and it's Lunus's day today on which I'm speaking. And some people believe you can see the face of this god, Abellio, and you can see it on the Croix de Belliou. This stone cross is believed to be the grave of Milaris, a 1,000-year-old patriarch who's mentioned in region tales of this area. Tatagu, another deity of the mountains, had a human aspect and was in charge of protecting the herds and pastures of the shepherds. And then the Basajun was the wild lord, also with a protective character, but was feared by the population. He's like half man, half animal. And then there's the Drac, or the Draco, or the dragon, who also appears in the mountains. So there's a lot of mythology here, which is very interesting, and anthropologists and folklorists have studied it. And it's often found in mountainous regions. I used to live in Wales and North Wales. The mountains there are very, very full of this sacred mythology, which was connected with Merlin, the Druid lore, and so on. I want to talk about the devil. The devil, the great dragon, whatever you want to call it. The devil is omnipresent in the Pyrenees region. He was known as the master of the Sabbath. Aquelarre, in the Basque country dialect, was seen as a monstrous being, often appearing in the form of a black goat. And he was known as the Tempter. He's sometimes called Le Monsieur, with respect, by the French. And this also in Haiti, among the Haitians, with the voodoo tradition. The devil is given, he's called a Baron. But there are a lot of demonic figures, serpents, dragons, and also a red donkey that was seen as often the red donkey takes the form of the devil. And sometimes there was a legend when a child jumps on the back of this red donkey, the spine lengthens. And then when all the children have settled on this long spined donkey, the donkey throws them all into the water and drowns them. These are ancient tales. I think that the devil figure and the links to Pyrenees are interesting. Scientologists even have a devil figure in their cosmology called Zenu. Now Zenu was a bit like Yaldabaoth, and if experts in comparative religion have studied Scientological theories, what they can find out about them, because the higher grades are a bit obscure, but they're like a modern neo-Gnostic tradition. Scientologists are like modern Gnostics, and when you get up to the highest grades, you learn that the world we're the suffering victims of an earlier trauma, a bit like the fall or Yaldabaoth's crazy rule. And they say Zenu, effectively, was that figure. He was deposed from power by the good guys, who are Sea Org and the Scientologists, wisdom people like Tom Cruise, Mission Impossible, save the planet from nasty Zenu. And then Zenu was imprisoned underground in the Pyrenees, according to Ron Hubbard, according to some of his teachings. Other Scientologists say, no, it wasn't the Pyrenees, somewhere else, we're not telling you where. But all the signs are it was possibly the Pyrenees, which is interesting. So, Scientology as a modern Gnostic movement has this same story, and you can read about it. There's you don't have to be a Scientologist to learn about this. It's now being revealed on the internet and in books. Our planet was called Tigiak, and Zenu was trying to really do quite masterly, horrible control systems to take over the world. And eventually the good guys won, but they couldn't depose them altogether. This is also interesting shades of the books of Enoch, because in the Enochian literature, the devil, Zenu, whatever, Yaldabaoth, is not finally defeated, but he's imprisoned in Tartarus by God, Yahweh, the good guys. And he's still there. And the final judgment will be when, Lucifer is let free from hell and God does the final judgment. Do some advanced theological research on this. And it's very interesting. There was a very interesting man called Goodwin Barmby, who was one of the first communists in Britain. He was an esotericist and a Unitarian minister of the church. Profound man, who wrote a book called The Marriage of Heaven and Hell, the reconciliation between God and the devil. And he foresaw a time, a bit like William Blake, who was one of his inspirers, that wisdom will be when Yahweh and Satan make up. And the fall of man, which has happened because of their communication difficulties, can be resolved. The Yazidis have a similar take to that. So, and there are people that think Lucifer's had a very bad press in conventional religion, and that there needs to be a bit of a redemption of this God-devil split. That was kind of Jung's view, and I think there's some psychological wisdom in this. But you have to be very tough to be able to face down these, the implications of all these archetypal stories when they recur in either your personal or your friend's psychology, because I think that there is a chance of peace if we approach this wisely. And that a lot of the devil legends are just that. They're just projections. They're just legends. It turns out that Hubbard's whole great cosmology may have been influenced by an early comic he'd read, which has that story plotline. A story called I Was a Slave of the Living Hulk, which he then adapted into his Scientology kind of script. So suspend judgment on all that, but I think the devil is redeemable, and that we can postpone the apocalyptic war that some religious groups say the only way to defeat evil is some sort of mega war, like a Third World War. Well, we discussed in the conference yesterday that there's no winners from that. If the planet goes down in a nuclear war, we all lose. And I'd rather organise, I'm happy to chair a conference between the God people and the devil people, and the goddess people and the Taoist people and the Manichaean people, and let's have an intellectual discussion about a peace treaty between all these followers and their faiths. That's why I've written the Interfaith Peace Treaty. I'm saying let's postpone World War III, let's have a peace treaty, and let scholars like us come together and discuss what was Muhammad's take on this devil versus God, what was the Roman Catholic take, what's the Anglican take, what's the Baptist, what's the Scientologists, what's the Gnostics. Let's be mature and let scholars come together and have a peace conference. Can we make peace at that very deepest possible level of theology? I think it's possible. I think that's what Christ would have wanted and what Mary Magdalene wanted. And I think it's what the poor people here who witnessed this genocide against the Cathars, that's all they were wanting, was truth. The only way we'll get peace is through truth. Let's go for it. That's what we scholars are supposed to be doing, isn't it? That's why Socrates taught. That's why Plato bothered to found the academy. If we're not doing truth, what's the point of our work? Suspend judgment. Okay, next point I want to make is, what about the Pyrenees during the French Revolutionary times? There's a history there. It's interesting. What do we know? Was that the long-awaited revenge of the Cathars? When the kind of Catholic monarch lost his head, literally, and the Catholic France fell. One of the things the Druids have knowledge about and the Etruscans are these long cycles of karma, long cycles of time. Tibetan Buddhism has the same knowledge, that events, in one epoch, they have karmic waves that then cause repercussions much later on. And the same souls, perhaps, reincarnating, have to go through the opposite. So maybe the people that were slaughtering and burning Cathars had to then go through and become, victims of the revolutionary excesses. I don't know. Discuss. But what I do know is that one local chap from Carcassonne called Fabre d'Eglantine was a poet and a playwright. He was given the name d'Eglantine, which is like a beautiful plant here in France, because he won a poetry contest in Carcassonne. He was like winning the Struga Poetry Festival in his day. And he then went to Paris, became a favourite playwright, and he was popular with the normal common people. He supported the revolution in its moderate phase, and he was asked to devise a new calendar. And he combined a lot of research. He had each month named after a time of year, the season, the time of mists, the time of flowers, the time of fruits, and so on. And then each day and each month had another agricultural type of description. And it's very druidical, this calendar, because the Druid calendar was 12 or 13 great trees. He used trees as well. Unfortunately, because of the chaos they'd unleashed, he himself ended up guillotined in 1794. He'd been a Freemason and, a kind of neo-Gnostic mystic, but saying, let's have wisdom for everybody, not just for the few. The man that devised the Reign of Terror was a man called Chaumette, who was another Freemason and a Republican. And he was very anti the Catholic Church. He said they were responsible for all the chaos of recent centuries. And he saw the Reign of Terror as a way of purging that folly. And he wanted the new calendar because he wanted to take away the saints' names, the names of the Christian year, replace it with nature. And the Committee of Public Safety declared that he should be able to institute the Reign of Terror, but eventually he was too much. He was a complex man because he organised the Feast of the Supreme Being in Notre Dame Cathedral, when they had a goddess actress dress up as the goddess of reason and sit on a throne in a mountain, symbolically, in the middle of Notre Dame Cathedral, which tragically, caught fire recently. He also declared ending of slavery in France and its colonies in that first period of the revolutionary triumph. And they wanted literally liberty, equality and fraternity for all mankind, men and women, black and white. And they ended slavery. And Chaumette gave a speech, which we've got the text, saying this is a great step for mankind, liberty for all, ending of slavery. He did some good stuff, I think. But he believed mistakenly that the way for mankind to move on intellectually is to kill off the old school thinkers. So he got the guillotine out and started killing off Catholics, priests, nuns, intellectuals, aristocrats, anyone that thought differently. And that's not the way to go. That unleashed the reigns of terror. It unleashed the Stalinist approach to revolution. It unleashed the worst aspects of Marxism, which Pol Pot did. Mao, that was Chaumette. That's not the way to go. That, in my opinion, that's swinging the pendulum too far the other way. Our job as historians, intellectual historians, is to try and find the moderate way of the swings, so that good and evil stop doing this I'm holier than thou and now going to kill you off battle, and instead they make a peace treaty somewhere in the middle way. The excesses of history between right and left, because of course right and left were first devised as a nomenclature of political science based on the French Revolutionary period. Now there was a war here at that time. The French revolutionary armies came to the Pyrenees and they went to war against Spain and Portugal in this region from March 1793 to July 1795. The Committee of Public Safety said that all French royalist prisoners who'd been captured, who were helping the Spanish, should be executed. Even some French Republican generals who failed to win enough battles were guillotined. The French Revolutionary Wars were fought pretty brutally by the Republicans, and even if you were a general for the Republican army and didn't win enough battles, you were guillotined. Unbelievable. So the French had executed Louis XVI on the 21st of January 1793. Then they'd annexed Belgium, the Austrian Netherlands. And then on the 1st of February they declared war on the UK and on Holland in their kind of revolutionary fervour. We're going to change the world through war and invasion. And on March the 7th they declared war on Spain. War is never the way to spread ideas. Sorry, it's just a foolish idea as a peace thinker. So what happened was there were huge battles between the Spanish armies and Portuguese and the French, and they fought all along this chain of mountains, the Pyrenees, and the battle went back and forth. Some won, some lost. It didn't lead to huge victories, but the French kept the Spanish out of France. They didn't succeed in invading, and likewise the French didn't really take over much of Spain. I think they won a bit of territory, but it was later under Napoleon that the French then did invade and take over Spain. But they didn't really succeed. There was no gain. Goya wrote his paintings showing the horrors of the French Republican army's deeds against the Spanish citizens. And it just unleashed chaos. And right and left fought in Spain right up until the Spanish Civil War and beyond. If only they'd sit down and sit at the feet of these ancient druids and ancient wisdom people, the Etruscan sages and the saints of the real invisible church, as Hegel called it, then these wars could be put behind us, in my opinion. In my opinion, war and militarism is the most dangerous tool that Yaldabaoth uses to control mankind and keep us in slavery, in fact. So Chamet saying slaves be free. No, we're slaves of a system based on militarism. And even Marx's brilliant analysis of capital, which I'm doing a commentary on, fails to make the link with militarism. He never talks about the role of militarism in capitalism. And it's become obvious in the 100 years since Marx wrote Das Kapital that is the key thing capital likes to do, is generate wars because it is the cheapest way to make vast profits for the military-industrial elites that run the planet, in the name of whatever they think they're doing. Yaldabaoth, the false god. So from an esoteric philosophical perspective, Marx got it wrong, but he opened the way for us to get it right. And so in doing my commentary on Marx, I'm trying to add that military capitalism critique in. Another thing that was going on, what about Freemasonry in the Pyrenees? That would be interesting, the history of Freemasonry in the region. It was around, it was the time of the Republicans, it was before the Republicans, the Lodge of the Nine Sisters, it was the time of the Enlightenment. Montesquieu was a Freemason up in Bordeaux and in Aquitaine, and there were Freemasonic lodges active, and they survived. Under the Nazi era, they were suppressed. The Nazis hated Freemasonry. They captured all the archives of the Grand Orient in Paris, took them, courtesy of the SS, to Germany, and went through them all. I don't know if they were ever returned, actually. It'd be very interesting to find out among Masonic historians. And a lot of Freemasons were rounded up and stuck in concentration camps. If the Nazis knew you were a senior Freemason, and they captured the membership lists in Paris, so they come looking for you throughout this region. But they survived. Some of them joined the resistance. There's a time sometimes when you have to fight back against evil. And the Vichy government also banned Freemasons. They kowtowed to the Nazis and said, no, it's a dangerous plot against humanity. Because mainly they were right-wing Roman Catholics imbued with a sort of anti-Masonic ideology, which the Anglican tradition and Protestant traditions don't have. It was all a very unfortunate mistake. It was tied in with anti-Semitism and this feeling that, the Jews shouldn't be allowed to be equal to the Christians. And Freemasonry gave them a level playing field. The lodges of Christians, the lodges of Jews were egalitarian. We worship one God, one deity, who is the Lord of truth, if you want. Anyway, there are lodges that survived, and they're now busy having conferences. Just in June, there was a conference, Equality, a struggle for Freemasons in the 21st century. It took place on the 4th of June, organised by the Loge La Parfaite Union in Montauban, which is just near Toulouse. And this is an active lodge going on at the moment. There was another big conference recently in the region, And these are open also to academics. You don't have to be a Freemason to go along. A lot of intellectuals in modern France are interested in Freemasonry because it's an amazing heritage. It was partly introduced by Chevalier Ramsay, who was a Scottish Jacobite who came to live near Paris at Saint-Germain. The court of Saint-Germain of the Jacobite king, James II in exile. A lot of Freemasons were there, including Charles Radcliffe, who was another introducer of Freemasonry into France. And the Lodge of the Nine Sisters was very important in the Enlightenment time, so they had members down here in the Pyrenees. Nowadays, the Grand Orient of France has a new Grand Master, Jean-Philippe Hugues, who has since April this year become the Grand Master. He was speaking down here in the Pyrenees at Foix, which is right here in Cathar country, just recently. There are 52,000 brothers and sisters in the Freemasonic lodges of the Grand Orient in France here. There are about 175,000 in total who are Freemasons. So it's not a vast amount, but it's, a lot of them are intellectuals, interesting people. There was another conference also called European Citizens for Liberty and Laicity, which means kind of secular universalism. I think some work needs doing intellectually in France on laicity. It shouldn't be anti-religion. It should be pro all the religions and pro-truth and pro-philosophic method. What French schools should be doing is teaching more philosophy, not in a kind of anti-religious way, but in a critical, intellectually advanced way, which is what the European Enlightenment stands for, and what Freemasonry in Britain stands for. But there's still a conversation to be had between the British and the French Freemasons over the existence of God, because in France you don't have to swear an oath you believe in the Grand Architect to become a Mason. You could be a total atheist, actually. In England, Britain, Scotland, you have to swear in your oath of initiation that you will follow the path of the Grand Architect of the universe. There is a God. Well, okay, interesting. Theologically, is there or isn't there? And what does it mean if there is? And what are we talking about? We're not talking about Yalda Bayoth, I hope. We don't have to swear an oath of allegiance to the dark, satanic causer of suffering. No, we have to swear an oath of allegiance to the Lord of Absolute Light, who's the Supreme Creator. That should be the Masonic deity. Unfortunately, some people have misused the tradition and created a sort of fallen god that you worship with secrecy and all the rest of it. And some dark characters have been Masons, like that weird guy that shot up loads of people in Norway, who's now in prison for life, who's an extreme right, activist, white racist. These people are not following wisdom. These people are following some fake Yalda Bayoth image, and they give Masonry a very bad name indeed. Okay, I want to move on to discuss something that interests me, because I've written a book about Marxism and esotericism. Coming from a Marxist background, my mother was a communist active since World War II. I'm interested in left-wing esotericism. Traditionally it's said, no, esoterics, they're more on the right, not on the left, and people on the left are more scientific and Marxist and so on. But in my research I uncovered that Marx and other left-wing intellectuals were steeped in what I call left-wing esotericism. Now, it's been left out of history. Most of the great experts in esoteric history, professors at the moment like Antoine Fèvre and others, and my friend Nicholas Goodwin Clark, have focused on right-wing esotericism. And that's the kind of Steve Bannon mistake. These people are fascinated by esotericism, but they associate it with right-wing esotericism. Because, yes, the right opposed the excesses of revolution, so good people therefore ought to be on the right. That's the way they think. But no, hang on, because the right wing did terrible excesses too, and terrors, and Auschwitz and Dachau, and etc. So, what about a left wing esotericism to balance it? Well, I've discovered yes, there was and is, and it was way flourishing here in the Pyrenees. Picasso, for instance, a great artist who was Spanish, French, whatever, cosmopolitan, who was an active member of the Communist Party, he painted the Dove of Peace, which became the symbol of Le Mouvement de la Paix, my mother's great movement for peace here in France. He loved the Pyrenees. Picasso came here in Serret, which is a town not far from here in the Pyrenees. It gets the first cherries in the spring of the whole of France, and cherries are shipped all across France. And he set up an artist's colony. He left Paris, and in Serret there was this artist's academy. And he was soon joined by Matisse, a Catalan painter, Manolo Huguet, Georges Braque, and Juan Gris. They all focused on Serret, or Serret it's probably pronounced. And they were doing art, music, sculpture, poetry. It became the Mecca of the Cubists, as it's called. And the first collages as artistic expressions were going on here. This is during the period up to and just after World War I. Other painters, Raoul Dufy and the poet Jean Cocteau, also came to Serret. It became like a Mecca for these left-wing intellectuals from Paris. Later, up to World War II, it carried on with Marc Chagall coming here, the great Jewish painter Jean Dubuffet, and Tristan Tzara, fleeing Nazism. They came to Serret because it's like a few miles from Spain, and if the Nazis were to turn up, they could nip across the border. There's a museum of modern art now in this small town at Serret, which only has 7,500 people. And it has many original works of these artists. It was created in the 1950s with the support of painters. So that's one example of what I call left-wing esotericism. Picasso was an active member of the Communist Party until his death in 1973. And I remember as a young boy coming to Collioure, exploring the Pyrenees with my mother, and she took me to the Picasso Museum looking at these things. And for her it was obviously like going to a shrine. In our house in Brighton, which was a left-wing Mecca, there were lots of Picasso reproductions, and the Dove of Peace was everywhere. Well, now it's here in the Peace Museum in France, and that tradition, the artists who did paintings for the Mouvement de la Paix, that lives on here in the Peace Museum of Europe. But this left-wing esotericism, which wants peace, has been written out of history. We have sort of right-wing esotericism. Picasso then he tried to use art to make the message for peace. When the Nazi Stuka bombers supported Franco and the fascists to bomb Guernica, he said that's a bridge too far. He painted the most famous peace painting on Guernica for the Spanish Republican exhibition in the Paris exhibition at the time, in the 1930s. And, we know enough about the killing at Guernica. It was a war crime, totally, by these fascists. And Picasso's response was to do a painting. Later, as a lifelong socialist committed to world peace, watching the horrors of World War II coming up, and he then painted another painting, the Charnel House, which is a great mural showing the death camps. It was his response to the Holocaust and genocide and the horrors of World War II. He said, this is like a charnel house, and it's full of dismembered, it's a horrible but necessary painting. He was an artist prepared to use his craft to try and educate mankind. Recently there's been an exhibition in Liverpool, at the Tate Modern in Liverpool, of Picasso's peace art. They assembled it all and put it together, and it was a very important exhibition. First time it's ever been done, Picasso as a peace artist. And there was a very important educational pack for teachers, because they would take groups of school kids. This ought to be taught in our schools, this ought to be taught in our art history lessons. Peace art. We have a room at the Museum of Art, at the Museum of Peace here in France, dedicated to art and peace. It was 1937 that Picasso painted Guernica for the Spanish pavilion at the World Fair, which was held in Paris that year. And after it was over, technically it belonged to the Spanish government, but Picasso himself rolled up the painting and took it back to his studio, and he kept it, and then he showed it at places around, including in New York. Another great left-wing artist, really,